I remember the morning I woke up to the shadow. It passed across my bedroom ceiling like a slow, mechanical eclipse, the gondola chair swaying past my window at exactly 7:04 a.m., carrying a man in a red ski jacket and goggles who glanced down at my cabin with the casual curiosity of someone peering into a fishbowl at the county fair. He wasn't alarmed. He wasn't apologetic. He was simply looking, the way tourists look at things that exist for their entertainment. He looked at me, my house, my roof, my life, and then looked away again toward the white slope ahead of him and was gone. I lay in bed for a long time after that. I had owned Cabin 14 on Ridgeback Mountain for 11 years. I had bought it in the autumn when the aspens were turning gold and the access road was still paved, and the nearest ski lift was a comfortable half-mile to the north. I bought it for the silence. I had a job that involved a lot of noise. I am a sound designer for theater, and I spend my working hours surrounded by speakers and cables and the carefully engineered illusions of sound. The cabin was my opposite. It was where I went to hear nothing. I had bought it before the resort expansion, before the Solverson Group arrived with their environmental impact studies and their community benefit projections, before the HOA board voted 9-3 to approve a master plan that would triple the mountain's lift capacity over 5 years, before someone in an office, I imagine a large office, with a whiteboard and a lot of coffee cups, drew a line on a map and decided that the most efficient path for the new sunrise express chairlift ran directly over the private cabin easement on the eastern slope. Over my cabin. The paperwork came in February, buried in page 31 of a 48-page HOA quarterly update. The quarterly update was sent by email. The email subject line was Q1 Community Newsletter, Mountain News, Trail Updates, and HOA Financials. I had never read a quarterly HOA newsletter in my life. I signed the acknowledgement page, which I always signed, because not signing meant a late fee. I signed it without reading it. I sent it back. I poured another cup of coffee and forgot about it entirely. By the time spring thaw arrived, a construction crew of 20 men was sinking concrete pylons into the hillside 50 yards from my front porch. The machines ran from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening. The ground shook. My coffee cups rattled in the cabinet. A family of elk that had been using the meadow below my property for as long as I had owned the place vanished overnight and did not come back for 2 months. My neighbor Dale came over one morning with 2 cold beers, even though it was 9 a.m. and a Tuesday, and we stood on my porch and watched the excavators work. "You know what this means," he said. "It means I have a chairlift over my house," I said. "It means," he said, pressing the bottle into my hand and looking up at the pylon frames rising against the sky, "that you are now a landmark." He meant it as a joke. I didn't laugh. I took a sip of the beer, cold slightly. Wrong for 9 in the morning, slightly right for what I was looking at, and I thought about what it meant to be a landmark, something people look at from a distance, something on a map, something that exists in the minds of strangers primarily as a point of reference. Somewhere in the back of my mind, very quietly, something stirred. Something small and patient and very, very petty. The Sunrise Express chairlift officially opened on December 3rd, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by the resort's general manager, 2 local aldermen, a food truck, and a woman dressed as a cartoon mountain goat who waved at the arriving skiers. I watched from my window. By December 4th, I had a plan. Fully compliant were the 2 words HOA President Gerald Marsh said most often, and with the most visible pleasure. Gerald was a compact man in his late 50s with silver hair that was always very precisely cut and a posture that suggested he had at some point in his life attended a seminar about the power of posture. He had been HOA president for 6 years. He approached the role with the energy of someone who believed, with complete sincerity, that property values were a form of community service. When he walked into a room, he walked in with his chin level and his hands loose at his sides. And when he sat down at the head of the HOA meeting table, he sat down the way a judge sits down. Fully compliant with noise ordinances. Fully compliant with the easement agreement. Fully compliant with the 3 separate engineering reviews. Fully compliant with state and county lift installation regulations. Gerald used the phrase the way other men used cologne, liberally, and as a substitute for something more meaningful. Specifically, as a substitute for, "I understand that this has been difficult for you personally." I attended my first HOA meeting 2 weeks after the lift opened. I had written down 4 questions on a notepad. I raised my hand and asked the first one, which was about the vibration levels I had been experiencing in my walls every time a chair passed overhead on the bull wheel. Gerald said the vibration levels were within acceptable range and had been independently verified. I asked who had done the verification. He named a company I had not heard of. I asked if I could see the report. He said it was available upon request. I requested it that evening via the HOAS online portal. I received it 3 weeks later. It was 11 pages long, dense with technical language, and concluded on page 9 that minor harmonic resonance at the cabin easement boundary falls within Class B residential tolerance thresholds. I do not know what a Class B residential tolerance threshold is. I am not an engineer, but I know what vibration sounds like inside a wall, and I know the difference between minor and not minor. I attended a second meeting and raised my hand again. This time, I asked about the visual intrusion, the chairs drifting past my bedroom window from 7 in the morning until 9 at night, every operating day. Gerald said that the visual element of the lift was, in fact, an amenity. You can see the skiers, he told me, as if this were a gift he was giving me personally. You can watch people enjoying the mountain. Gerald, I said, I can see them eating sandwiches. He blinked. It was the closest thing to uncertainty I had ever seen on his face. The lift serves the whole community, he said, recovering. I looked around the room. There were 12 other cabin owners present. Most of them lived on the western slope. Their views were unobstructed mountains and pine trees and, on clear days, a thin blue line that might have been a distant lake. Their rooftops were cable-free. Their mornings were not interrupted by the low hum of a hall cable starting up at 7 a.m. They nodded at Gerald like parishioners at a sermon, the kind of nodding that is less about agreement and more about wanting to get to the coffee reception afterward. I drove home that night with my headlights cutting through falling snow, past the pylons rising at the edge of my property, past the empty chairs swaying dark and silent against the sky. The lift was shut down for the night. The mountain was quiet in the way mountains are quiet after machinery stops. Not peaceful exactly, but released. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what I actually had. I had a cabin that was now, legally and permanently, directly beneath a major ski resort attraction. I had hundreds of captive riders every operating day, gondola passengers with absolutely nothing to do for 4 minutes and 20 seconds except sit, look around, and listen. And I had something most of them did not, a professional understanding of how sound works, a full recording studio in my spare bedroom, and absolutely nothing to lose. The mountain had made me an attraction. Fine, I would give them a show. I am by trade a sound designer for theater. I have spent 22 years making audiences hear things that do not exist, creaking ships in landlocked theaters, collapsing buildings on flat stages, storms rolling in from the wings while the air conditioning hums quietly above a seated crowd of 400 people. I know how sound moves through space. I know how it bounces off surfaces and changes character with distance and temperature. I know, most importantly, how it triggers the primitive, lizard brain parts of human cognition, the parts that existed before language, before reason, before the capacity to say to yourself, That sound is probably not what I think it is. The human brain, when it hears a creak, does not wait for analysis. It reacts. It tightens the chest. It sharpens the eyes. It sends a cold, quick signal down the spine that says, "Pay attention." This is true in a theater. It is doubly true when you are sitting in an open gondola chair, suspended 40 feet above the ground, with nothing between you and the mountain air. I spent 2 weeks writing the script. The concept was simple, elegant in its specificity. I would place 3 weatherproof speakers on my rooftop, positioned to project sound upward into the lift corridor at a 45-degree angle. From 8 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon on weekend operating days, peak ride time. When the chairs ran at full capacity, I would play a looping audio drama, not music, not ambient noise, not anything that could easily be tuned out or categorized as background, a story. A specific, detailed, realistic-sounding story. Specifically, the story of a chairlift that was falling apart. I wrote it in the style of a found-footage documentary, the kind of audio you might hear if someone had secretly recorded 2 engineers having a conversation they were not supposed to be having. The engineers were named Prentice and Volk. I gave them full backstories that never appeared in the script, but informed the way I wrote their dialogue. Prentice was cautious, methodical, a man who had been in the industry for 30 years and had seen one too many cut corners. Volk was younger, more nervous, caught between professional loyalty and a conscience he hadn't quite learned to ignore. I used names that sounded specific and plausible without being real. The Holloway bracket. The secondary tension coupling, the 2019 incident report. I referenced real-sounding regulatory bodies. I mentioned the Grindelwald situation exactly once, in a way that made it sound like something everyone in the industry knew about and no one discussed openly. I gave the dialogue the rhythm of people who were not performing for an audience, overlapping sentences, pauses, dropped words, the way real conversation sounds when 2 people are worried. The key exchange, which I placed at the 2-minute mark of the 4-minute loop, went like this. "Look, I'm just saying what the stress analysis shows. Nobody wants to hear it. I understand that. But after what happened in Grindelwald, we are not supposed to talk about Grindelwald." Pause. The sound of wind. The low creak of a cable under tension. I just think the writers should know. That's all I'm saying. I recorded it in my spare bedroom, using 2 condenser microphones at different distances to create the natural acoustic depth of an outdoor conversation. I ran the dialogue through a reverb chain calibrated to the specific acoustic character of an open mountain slope. The slight delay on consonants, the way the air swallows bass frequencies and leaves the mid-range exposed. I mixed in actual chairlift sounds, purchased legally and without restriction from a professional sound effects library. The distinctive clunk of a bull wheel, the low, constant hum of the hall cable, the mechanical sigh of a chair passing a pylon. I timed the final mix so that the most alarming moment, the Grindelwald exchange, followed by the sound of what could plausibly be interpreted as a bracket under stress, fell at approximately the midpoint of a standard 4-minute ride, long enough that riders had stopped looking at the scenery and had settled into that mild, receptive boredom that is the natural state of a chairlift passenger, early enough that they still had 2 minutes left to sit with whatever feeling the audio had produced. I did one test playback from the ground, standing in the spot where the chairs passed directly overhead to check the projection angle and volume. The words were crisp. The ambient sounds blended naturally. You could hear it clearly from a sitting position above, but it faded quickly to the side so it wouldn't carry to the lodge or the base area. Specific, targeted, contained. Then I waited for the first good Saturday. The morning of January 22nd arrived clear and very cold, with that particular mountain silence that settles in when the temperature drops below 15 degrees. A silence so complete it feels pressurized, like the air itself is holding still. I was up at 5:30. I made coffee in the dark and drank it at the kitchen table, watching the sky lighten from black to the deep, bruised purple that comes just before dawn at altitude. By 6, I had the speakers positioned on the rooftop, 2 angled north, 1 angled slightly east to account for the prevailing wind direction. I ran the cable down through the bathroom window, inelegant but functional, and connected it to my interface in the living room. The lift started running at 7, as it always did. I could hear the machinery from inside the cabin, the deep, rhythmic clunk of the drive wheels starting up, the hum of the cable coming to tension. The first chairs of the day moved empty, warming up the system, carrying no one. For the first hour, I left the audio off. This was deliberate. Early morning riders are alert, caffeinated, purposeful. People who have driven up from the valley before dawn and are focused on getting first tracks on fresh snow. They are not in the receptive, slightly bored state I needed. I wanted the 8 o'clock crowd, the families, the recreational skiers, the people who had slept in and were now settling into a comfortable day on the mountain, their guard completely down. At 8:03, I pressed play. Already filed the report. The question is whether anyone actually reads it before. Keep your voice down. There's nobody out here. There's always somebody out here. I sat by the living room window with my thermos of coffee and watched. For the first 3 chairs, nothing. The riders passed overhead with their faces turned toward the slope, toward the mountain, toward the blue sky above the tree line. Normal. Expected. The audio was there, but they hadn't registered it yet. Their brains had filed it under background noise and moved on. Then came a couple in matching green jackets. The woman was looking at her phone. The man was watching the trees below. And then, I saw the exact moment it happened. His head moved. Not a sharp turn, but a slow, involuntary pivot, the way your head moves when you hear something in another room that doesn't quite fit. He tilted his face downward. He looked at my roof. His mouth moved. He was saying something to his companion. She looked up from her phone. They both looked down at my cabin. I raised my coffee cup and kept my face completely neutral. By 10 o'clock, I had documented. I was keeping notes because I'm a professional, and this was, I had decided, a professional project. 9 separate reactive incidents. A man in a yellow jacket who cocked his head so sharply he nearly dislodged his helmet. 2 teenage boys who immediately pulled out their phones, almost certainly to record. A group of 4 who leaned together, the way people lean when they are confirming to each other that they heard the same thing. 1 woman who said something to her companion and then looked directly back at the slope below her, at the snow, as if she was calculating the distance to the ground. And 1 older man riding alone, in a dark blue jacket and a hat that had a small flag pin on it. He heard the Grindelwald exchange. I watched him reach forward and grip the safety bar with both hands. He kept them there, both hands, until I could no longer see him above the tree line. I felt genuinely terrible about the last one. I sat with that feeling for a while. But I also felt, for the first time since I had stood on my porch watching concrete pylons go into the ground 50 yards from my property, genuinely alive. Like the equation had shifted slightly in a direction that was no longer entirely against me. I pressed stop at 3 o'clock, exactly as planned. I brought the speakers inside. I poured a second thermos of coffee, went out to the porch, and sat in the cold for an hour, looking at the chairs moving empty against the sky as the lift cycled down for the afternoon pause. It was a very good Saturday. Gerald Marsh called me on Monday morning at 8:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I had been awake since 6 and was already on my second cup of coffee and had been half expecting the call since the night before. "We've received reports," he said, in the tone of a man who has practiced saying something calmly, "of some kind of audio disturbance emanating from your property over the weekend." Audio disturbance? I said. I'm not sure what you mean. Riders on the Sunrise Express are reporting a pause. I could hear him reading from something, or possibly from a screen. Alarming conversations about structural failure being broadcast in the vicinity of your cabin. I let that sit for a moment. Gerald, I said, I'm a sound designer. I work in theatrical audio. I sometimes play back recordings of my work at home for review and mixing purposes. I wasn't aware that was a problem. At 8 in the morning, he said, from your roof. Acoustics are very different outdoors, I said. The roof gives me a neutral listening position without interior reflections. It's a professional technique. There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. In my experience, Gerald's silences never lasted more than 2. I had found a gap he didn't have a prepared answer for. The HOA, he said finally, carefully, would like to remind you that any amplified sound output above 65 decibels between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. requires written notice to the HOA board, filed a minimum of 14 days in advance of the planned activity. 14 days, I repeated. I wrote it down on the notepad next to my coffee cup. Thank you for the reminder, Gerald. I'll make sure to be in compliance going forward. We would appreciate that, he said. Of course, I said. Is there anything else? There wasn't. He said goodbye. I said goodbye. I finished my coffee. I filed the notice that afternoon through the HOA online portal, which I now knew how to navigate quite well after 18 months of complaint submissions and document requests. The notice form had fields for event type, equipment specifications, decibel rating, broadcast hours, and content description. I filled each one out carefully and completely. In the content description field, I wrote, original dramatic audio work exploring themes of infrastructure, institutional accountability, and the relationship between private residents and public amenity systems. Running time approximately 4 minutes, looped. Work is clearly labeled as theatrical fiction in all associated communications. I submitted the form at 4:47 p.m. The system sent an automatic confirmation. Gerald had 14 days to respond. He approved it on day 6. I genuinely believe he did not read the content description. I think he saw the form, saw that it was properly filled out, saw that it included the correct decibel rating, and clicked approve the way you click. Accept on a software terms of service agreement quickly without looking too closely at what you're agreeing to. 2 weeks later, on the first Saturday after the approval cleared, I carried the speakers back to the roof. Episode 2 was called The Cover-Up. It was 12 minutes long, which meant I had to loop it 3 times across the operating window. But I had restructured it so each loop felt like a continuation rather than a repetition. Prentice and Volk had found additional documents. There was now a third voice, a woman named Harker, who spoke in the measured tones of someone who had been asked to make a problem disappear and was beginning to have second thoughts. By then, I had a mailing list of 47 people who had emailed me. After Dale's video circulated, I sent them a 30-second preview clip and the broadcast schedule. By then, this had become something larger than I had planned. I had not intended to tell anyone outside the mountain community. The project, as I had conceived it, was personal, a private act of creative resistance directed at a specific institution that had decided my home was a navigable corridor. I had not imagined an audience beyond the passengers on the Sunrise Express and, perhaps, Gerald Marsh. But Dale, who had been watching from his porch the first Saturday with a pair of binoculars that I genuinely do not know the origin of, and who had apparently been filming intermittently with his phone throughout the morning, posted a 30-second clip to the Ridgeback Mountain Community Forum on Saturday evening under the title, Guy Under the Chairlift is doing something incredible, and I need everyone to see it. It got 412 shares in 48 hours. By Sunday evening, it had been reposted to 3 regional outdoor recreation groups and one subreddit about petty but technically legal revenge, which I was not previously aware existed, and which turned out to have 2.3 million members. I know this because 17 of them emailed me. The emails came through my website, which I had not updated since 2019, and which still had my professional bio and a portfolio of theatrical projects I had worked on, which I suppose gave the impression that I was credible and intentional rather than just a man with speakers and a grudge. The emails ranged from enthusiastic, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever read about," to concerned, "Are you sure this is legal?" to suspicious, "Is this real? Or is this a bit?" The answer to the last question was both, depending on how you looked at it. There was a reporter from a regional outdoor lifestyle magazine who wanted to write about the cabin under the chairlift. I politely declined, then reconsidered, then agreed to an email interview, which I answered carefully and with specific attention to the word theatrical. There were 2 lawyers, one who appeared to represent someone connected to the resort and asked questions I did not answer, and one who was a fan and just wanted to tell me I was doing nothing illegal, which I already knew, but appreciated hearing from a professional. And there was the man from Geneva. He wrote in careful, formal English and said that he had been on a ski holiday in Grindelwald, Switzerland in the winter of 2019, and that he had witnessed something on a chairlift there that had never been properly explained or publicly acknowledged, and that he assumed I was referring to this event in my audio drama and wanted to know if I had access to information that had not been released to the public. I read his email 3 times. I did not know anything about any incident in Grindelwald in 2019. I had invented the Grindelwald reference entirely. It was a piece of fictional geography I had chosen. Grindelwald because it is a real place with a real ski resort, and because the name sounds vaguely ominous in a way that serves dramatic audio. The situation Prentice and Volk were forbidden to discuss was entirely a product of my imagination. I emailed the man from Geneva back and said that I was not in a position to comment on specific incidents referenced in the work. He responded with 3 dense paragraphs about what had actually happened. He included a date, a lift name, and the surnames of 2 people he said had been present. I read the email twice, saved it to a folder labeled Geneva, and did not reply. I added 211 people to the mailing list in the first 10 days. I sent them a longer field recording from episode 3, which I had titled The Whistleblower, and which introduced a 4th character, a former resort employee named Delacroix, who had kept copies of everything, along with a cover note that stated, clearly and in plain language, that the audio work was a theatrical fiction, that it was designed as an artistic response to the experience of being a private resident whose home had been made involuntarily public by an institutional decision made without meaningful consultation, that none of the incidents, people, technical names, or regulatory bodies referenced in the audio were real, with the exception of the general laws of physics governing cable tension. I made that part very clear. I wanted it documented. The HOA received a cease and desist request from the resort's legal team on a Thursday morning in February. Gerald called me that afternoon. His voice had changed. I had spoken to Gerald many times over the past 18 months, and his voice had always had a specific quality, controlled, surface smooth, the voice of a man who had decided in advance what could and could not touch him. That quality was no longer entirely present. "You're saying it's creating a safety issue," Gerald said. "Riders are getting off the lift and asking staff about structural concerns. Some people are choosing not to ride." "That sounds like a public relations problem for the resort," I said. "They're saying it's your problem. They're saying you created it." "Gerald," I said, and I tried to keep my voice as level and careful as his normally was, "I filed every form. On time. Completely. My content is clearly labeled theatrical fiction on my website. which I have linked in every communication I've sent to the mailing list. The filing is on record with the HOA. Approved by you personally 6 days after submission. I have receipts for the sound library assets. I have the script, dated, and timestamped. I am, at every level, fully compliant. The silence on his end lasted much longer than 4 seconds. It was the most satisfying sound I had experienced in over a year. In the end, nobody went to court. This was not because the legal questions were simple, they were not, but because going to court is expensive and slow and public in ways that are difficult to control. And the resort's PR team had apparently concluded that a headline reading, "Ski Resort Sues Man Living Under Its Chairlift," would not serve the mountain's brand in the way they hoped. The process took about 6 weeks. There was a letter from the resort's lawyers, 3 pages long, laying out their position in careful language. There was a letter back from my lawyer. I had hired one. Finally, the fan lawyer from the mailing list, who turned out to be excellent, that was 5 pages long, and laid out my position with what I felt was appropriate thoroughness. There was a phone call between the lawyers that I was not on. There was a second phone call that I was on briefly, during which I said very little and my lawyer said a great deal. The HOA convened an emergency session on a Tuesday evening in early March. I attended via video call from my kitchen table, wearing a blazer and, below the camera frame, no pants. This felt appropriate. Gerald ran the meeting. He looked tired in a specific way that successful, organized people look tired when a situation has exceeded their capacity to organize it. Gerald presented the resort's proposal, a formal written acknowledgement entered into the HOA's official record, that the Sunrise Express installation had caused undue residential disruption to the occupants of the Eastern Slope easement, specifically Cabin 14. A monthly payment into what they called an amenity offset fund, which was a way of saying compensation without using a word that implied they had done something wrong, and a sound barrier to be constructed along the eastern pylon line, which would reduce the vibration resonance I had been complaining about for 18 months and would, as a secondary effect, reduce the sound projection angle from my rooftop. The barrier was their idea. I thought that was very funny. My lawyer presented my counterproposal, the same 3 terms, accepted in full, with one addition. A plaque, Gerald repeated. He said it the way you repeat something when you are trying to understand whether you heard it correctly. Yes, I said. Mounted on the eastern pylon. The one closest to my property line, brushed aluminum, simple design, acknowledging that Cabin 14 existed here before the lift was constructed, that a private resident lives beneath this infrastructure, that the mountain is shared space, and that sharing requires acknowledgement. Gerald looked at the resort's representative, who was on the call in a small square in the upper right corner of my screen. The resort representative looked at the person next to them, who I assumed was their lawyer. There was a muted discussion. The square stayed muted for a while. They argued about the plaque for 2 weeks. The lawyers argued about the specific wording for another 10 days after that. There were 4 drafts. The first one was extremely corporate and referenced community partnership twice. I rejected it. The second one was better, but omitted the word home, which I felt was the whole point. The third draft my lawyer said was acceptable, but I felt missed something. The fourth draft read, "This corridor passes over private residential land. The cabin below has been home since 2013. We share this mountain." I said yes to the fourth draft. They installed it on a Tuesday in late March, when the season was winding down and the snow was thinning to bare patches on the southern-facing runs. A man from the resort's maintenance crew came with 2 bolts and a drill. He was there for about 20 minutes. He did not know why he was installing a plaque on a chairlift pylon, and I did not explain it to him. He drove away in a white truck. I walked out and stood in front of it for a while. Brushed aluminum, exactly as specified. The letters were cleanly cut, the right size, easy to read from a few feet away. I thought about whether someone on the chairlift, riding overhead, would be able to read it. Probably not. It faced outward, toward the slope, not upward toward the cable. It was not for the riders, it was for me. It was for anyone who walked up to this pylon and stood where I was standing. Dale came over with 2 beers. He handed me one without saying anything and stood next to me, looking at the plaque. "How do you feel?" he asked after a while. I looked up at the empty chairs swaying in the cold afternoon light, cables humming their low, steady note against the wind. Above my roof, above 11 years of early mornings and coffee on the porch and elk in the meadow, and the specific silence of a mountain cabin before machinery arrived. Above all of it, still, like I want to do one more episode, I said. Dale took a slow sip of his beer. "What's it about?" I looked at the plaque. I thought about Prentice and Volk and Harker and Delacroix. I thought about the man from Geneva, whose email was still in the folder I had not returned to. I thought about the old man in the dark blue jacket, gripping the safety bar with both hands. I thought about Gerald's voice on the phone, and about the sound barrier going up along the eastern pylon line, and about what it feels like to make something, a sound, a story, a small aluminum sign that changes the shape of a place, even slightly. It's about the plaque, I said. What it means to put a name on something, to say, a person was here. This was a home. Remember that. Dale handed me the other beer. We stood there in the cold for a long time, 2 neighbors on a mountain, not saying much. The chairs moved overhead in a slow, steady line, empty now, winding down for the season. The cable hummed. The wind came through the pines. And for the first time in over a year, the sound above me didn't bother me at all.